Thanks, Greg and Colleen and everyone here. And also thank you to Karla for asking me to be here today. It's like such a treat to get to talk about these incredible paintings with you all. So I thought before, I have some questions prepared, but I thought before that I would just give you all a little fun story about us knowing each other, which has only been about 6 years. I think we met about 6 years ago. I was running the lecture series up at Sonoma State University, and I brought her up to talk. I didn't know her personally, but I knew of her work and was really excited to have her. And she came up and spoke, and we hit it off immediately and became fast friends. And but within a little while of talking to her, we found out these like incredible parallels in our lives, which is sort of fun to share. So it turns out that not only did we grow up in the same city in Berkeley, just across the bay, but it turns out, in fact, we grew up on the same block, quite literally. We then both went east for graduate school in painting. We spent our postgraduate years, at least some of them, living in Brooklyn and doing the teaching working artist thing. And then if that's not enough for parallels, we both ended up driving back across, I think we both were driving too. I mean, it's like, yeah, back across the country with our infant daughters in tow to resettle here in the Bay Area with our kids to be near their grandparents, and are now both doing the magnificent, if I may say so myself, juggling act of parenting, teaching, and in maintaining an active studio practice. So I feel Karla has a very special place in my heart, aside from being the incredible artist that she is. So I thought with that, and in honor of our daughters, who are now very good friends, I would start with the basics and ask you, Karla, what is your favorite color?
Well, so when you're a parent and a painter, you think a lot about this, right? As a topic. My favorite color is like an orangey red, like a cadmium red light for the painters in the room. And yeah, I just love that color. It's just there's so much pop. You don't need that much of it. It does a lot, says a lot. I had an experience in my final graduate critique with one of my professors, Mel Bachner, and he said, it was like he twisted the knife at the end and said he was very into the work, and I was like, but there's cadmium red light in every single one of these paintings. And I was like, oh God. So there still is. I'm very interested in like orchestrating a lot of color. So that color is always there.
I'm so impressed that you have an answer for that question. That's really good. And then I have to ask also, like looking at your paintings, there's so many different, there's like a universe of different mark making approaches. And I'm wondering if you have a favorite tool, like implement, brush, because it's very different from my work. I use only very teensy tiny brushes, so.
I mean, I use a lot of different size brushes. And I use palette knives, and I use a lot of oil stick, especially in this new work. But recently I've actually been using a lot of small brushes, which has been interesting because I didn't historically use small brushes, but I don't know. Yeah, I've gotten really into like small rounds and just like things that I can be very specific with, like really small marks or like crisp edges. So weirdly, I'm going to say also small brushes, which is, yeah.
I can relate. So I guess I've had the pleasure of being in your studio many times. And for those of you who don't know, Karla built a studio in her garage. And some of the biggest paintings, I think it's these, you'll have to tell me if I'm wrong, but are within inches from the ceiling. And I've just always been so impressed at your willingness to push right up against whatever limitations are there, not only within the scale of the paintings, but also with circumstances. So I know that like during the pandemic, you were limited in your studio practice just because you were stuck at home and with having to do parenting all the time and homeschool. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that drawing became a bigger part of your practice during this time. Or I know you had a very pandemic-focused drawing practice that also sort of interwove with your parenting. And I'm wondering, I mean, drawing obviously plays a role in a lot of these paintings, and I'm curious if you would speak to your pandemic drawing practice and how that shows up in these paintings.
Yeah. So to go back to the size of the paintings, I have some 7-foot paintings, and those were the this
ones.
is 6,
Okay.
but same thing. They're very big and they don't fit well.
And you can't even you had to like angle them.
Oh yeah,
to
like I have
them.
to like turn them like this. It's very silly. But yes, drawing is really important to me. It always has been. But it's shifted over the years. It used to be something where I would draw sort of with mixed media, sort of as the first step that then would translate into like reference material for paintings. I don't know, in the last 10 years, I've really shifted to just working from my imagination, like on all fronts. And so I have a practice where I just draw with graphite, and I draw a lot. And during COVID, I started drawing more, and I started drawing every night for the most part, just like watching TV. I just, my painting practice sort of went on hold for 6 months. It was too much, like just figuring out teaching painting on Zoom and, dealing with my daughter, starting kindergarten on Zoom. And I don't know. I just I had to give myself a pass. It was the first time I'd taken that kind of break really since I became an artist. And, but it was interesting. It became like, it was actually really focusing, because it was really just sort of thinking through drawing and drawing with very low pressure. And the way that my practice is developed for drawing is I draw most nights. I draw on pretty high quality sketchbook paper so I can cut them out later. And then I look through my sketchbooks, I pull things that I think are interesting, I cut them out, I bring them to my studio, I have stacks of drawings, and then I like move them around and I figure out things I want to make paintings of. And so it's like been a way for me to really think intuitively and while finding a kind of a rigorous structure for the work, which I think I like in terms of composition and imagery. But so yeah, being very open, but also being able to be like very specific.
But a lot of the paintings in here are based on some of those graphic drawings.
Yeah, they all are. And and the other thing, so what happened, to go back to the pandemic piece of it, is subject-wise that this sort of, there was a lot of imagery of fires and sort of intense weather during that time, which was what was happening in California, as we all know. Just like that fall of 2020 was just so intense in terms of like just being stuck inside and smoke. And so that's actually where this sort of looping line in all the work came from, is drawing fire imagery. But it's not in the paintings. Sometimes it's smoke, but it turns into all these different things at this point. And then a lot of imagery like pulled from, Maisie and her day. And so I still have that practice, and it's, it's how I start all the paintings, is from these just like simple graphite drawings.
So they're kind of like a blueprint, and then would you say that the color and the rest of it is also approached intuitively the way that the drawing is, or?
Yes. Well, I mean, it's different, but it's all imagined. So I like having the drawing, as like a structure, and then I can play and move around and like, kind of like hang the painting on the drawing structure. And the paintings have a lot of, as you probably noticed, like a lot of areas are handled really differently. And so I don't know, like I think about these pockets and like passages, and so like the way that the linear structure of the drawing is it gives me that space to like play and like have all these different experiences. But it's all sort of like I start with an underpainting, so there's like a really washy acrylic layer, and that's usually pretty colorful. It's kind of like a bad abstract painting. I really don't think very much about it. I often do them and not knowing what the painting's actually, I might not have even chosen the drawing yet. Like it's just kind of like put something on it. And yeah, and it's in all the paintings still. So there's like, that's where the air is. If you see them, like there's this sort of like thin, washy layer that I like to like let peek out in different ways. So then like, I figure out the image and then I'm kind of reacting to the underpainting. And yeah, it's just like very, like I do something, I think about it, I do something else. It's a lot of looking, it's a lot of like, it's a lot of sitting back and looking at the work and like letting one thing sort of lead to another, which I think is really fun because I don't know what they're going to fit. I don't know what they'll look like when I'm done. And I think that, to me, that's exciting. I like that aspect of painting.
I was going to go back to the motherhood question, just because one of the questions that I often get asked is, how does motherhood or how does parenting affect your studio practice? I thought maybe make it a little more interesting and say, do you have maybe a story you could share with us, maybe about a particular painting in the room that maybe sort of exemplifies the sort of interweaving experiences of raising a child and being a creative person in the studio?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think my daughter liked my work I was making before this a lot more.
They're the harshest critics. Yeah.
Well, I had all these like image of like her toys in it, so she was like really, into that. So she felt like they were all about her, and so now I think she's a little disappointed. But no, I mean it's a big thing. I think just in like a very basic level, like so she named this painting. This is Lemon Lime, and so she came in and was like, this one should be called Lemon Lime. I was like, great, that's the perfect name for this painting. So like, there's just like little things like that. There's just like a play thing that I think about that's really connected to her. Sometimes she'll paint in the studio with me too, which is really fun, although that can get a little dicey sometimes. Like I don't know. She's, but yeah, I think, I don't know. There's like an in and out that happens when you have a home studio. So she's always like sticking her head in and saying something, or it's just, I guess and I feel like that's what my work over the last, really since I've been a parent, I had to sort of I had a moment where I made the decision I had to like let my identity as a parent come into my work because I was feeling really like struggling with that. Like I was confusing, like as an artist, it was like, that's like the most important thing of anything in my life, and then you have a kid and you're like, wait, no, this is the most, anyway, I just was like, I need to open this up and have the subject come in. And so I think in that sense, she's like really permeates the work, even if it's a little bit more subtle than like the body of work I made before this.
All right, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask, so you're talking about titles, and the title of this show, as well as the show that you had recently at MacDowell Gallery, both have kind of synesthesia, or they evoke synesthesia, or like the different sensorial experiences happening at the same time. And I'm wondering, I feel like your paintings are very joyful and very evocative of lots of different sensory experiences. And I'm wondering, when you're making them, are you really considering other senses other than the visual?
Yes, and I love thinking about them that way because I don't know that I did. It sort of just crept up on me. But yes, I think I think a lot about weather is like a subject, I think, in some of this work in like a more like literal sense, but with that comes like atmosphere and heat or humidity or wind, and so that idea of like moving through landscape in sort of an experiential way versus like more of like a straightforward image of a landscape is definitely something I'm thinking about with the work. And I think and then texture and touch, like I wish everyone could touch them because I'm obsessed with, I'm very obsessed with surface, and I think that like painting, even like very flat painting, is like skin on a surface, right? So I think the idea that it's something that we can, that has like a sort of sense of touch as like a big part of it. And then in this work, there's, along with the looping line that I was talking about earlier, there's a lot of like small marks, like a lot of like sort of divisionist stippling moments and like patterns and intense. So there's like an intensity and maybe like a sound thing going on, like a, you know, sound wave or rhythmic quality to it. So I'm really interested in that aspect of that way of sort of thinking about the paintings.
And the titles usually, are they afterthoughts, or are you going into it with these weird synesthesia titles, like
for the paintings?
Heavy Weather, whatever? Yeah.
Oh, well, for the shows, it was definitely like, oh, I have a show. Like the other show was called Sun Shower. So that moment when it's raining and sunny at the same time. Yeah, and then Heavy Weather, like this show, sort of intensity. Yeah, so for those, I was both thinking about it because I wanted that sense of landscape without it being like sort of a more straightforward landscape title. But as far as titling the work, I hate titling my work. And I often title them like really straightforward, just like, yeah, or have my daughter title them.
I gotta try that. I'm gonna try that.
Yeah, I highly recommend it.
Okay, so my favorite question is, do you have duds? And what makes a dud?
Yes.
We only see the things that pass, but what does it mean to make a bad Karla Wozniak painting?
There are a lot of duds. They get cut up.
Physically?
Yes,
Oh.
like taken off the stretcher and cut up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it takes a while to get to that phase. They kind of like sit around my studio for a while because I feel like maybe I can resurrect them. I don't know. I can be a real overworker, and like sometimes, like I love that moment where like something isn't working and then you like beat on it enough that like something else happened that like you weren't expecting, right? Like something kind of comes out of it on the other end. So sometimes that like sense of like struggle, it's kind of cliche, but I really believe in that. Like sometimes that can you end up somewhere really interesting when you sort of have that process. But sometimes it's just terrible. And I think for me, like the duds often, they get really dense, but then the composition isn't good enough. I think it's like, I don't know. Yeah, there's something that happens, or they're just like fine. So they're sitting around in the studio and they look fine. And I keep on trying to convince myself they're interesting, but they're not.
But so interesting to me because your paintings are so layered. I would think you would just keep layering them until you get to that. But for you, it's like there is a point at which it's like the history of that painting being underneath is not an option. It just needs to off with its head.
Yes, but like sometimes I can do that, right? Okay. Like there's like that piece over there in the corner. There's some stuff that happened in there that like was like to some big radical shifts. The Falling Leaves one, some big interventions, and it worked. So sometimes it works, and sometimes it's just like, but I think it's okay. I mean, I don't know. Like I think, I feel like we all have duds, and I think it's important because I think like students don't always understand that. It's like no. There's a lot of bad paintings. Like
do you do the bad painting assignment where you make people make a bad painting?
I have, but yeah, it's a good one.
It's another conversation.
Do you have duds?
Yeah, definitely. No one sees them.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, for me, my work is very heavily dependent on the photographic and computer source, and so for me, I think, I mean, there are duds for lots of reasons, but the biggest one is if the work itself, because my work is not ultimately about any photorealism of any kind. So if it doesn't transcend the reference, and usually, sometimes it could be because of the surface, sometimes it's a compositional thing, then to me that's like the fundamental dud. But and sometimes it's just it needed another couple layers, and sometimes it's just it fundamentally doesn't work. Yeah. So But I spend so long on my surfaces that if it doesn't really work, I will sand it down.
Yeah.
Because I can't afford to linen and hours, and so anyway. But I don't ever use anywhere near the quantity of paint you do, so I get why sometimes it needs to be cut.
Sometimes it just needs to be cut up. It's also very satisfying. It's like recognizing that it's just a failure. So
was it
cut it up?
Was it Agnes Martin who used to have like bonfires at the end of every year with her bad paintings? I think, sounds not healthy. But I guess if you're outside in New Mexico and the wind is blowing the other way, it's okay. Well, I guess then we're both pretty dedicated to painting as a medium, and I'm sure, even though we're sort of a little removed in terms of when we were in art school, but the whole sort of painting is dead thing was alive. I don't think it's really relevant anymore, but given that it's something that was in our midst when we were, young adults, I'm curious, it's 2024, there's incredible work being made that doesn't even fit in the confine of a medium. And so I guess why painting? What does it mean to be painting in 2024 to you? And why paint?
Yeah. Well, it is funny that I was in art school in the 90s, late 90s, and date myself, and then in grad school in the early 2000s, and the conversation was so much around this idea of like painting dying and like dying over and over again. Like the photograph killed painting, and then like video art killed painting, and then,
painting killed painting.
Painting killed painting, and it's just this really silly in retrospect. I mean, interesting, but it's funny now how not relevant it feels, in the sense that like what's so great about painting now is it's so open and there isn't one narrative. So I think that those conversations really like hinged on a very, modernist Western European sort of approach to thinking that just is not how we
very
roll
narrow
anymore.
Narrow,
so hopefully. And so I think in that sense, I don't know. It doesn't like, I don't feel like it comes into my classroom much in a way that it did definitely when I was in school. But that said, I think painting is, to me, there's like another threat to painting dying, which has to do with like Instagram, honestly, like the idea that people are not seeing paintings in person in the way that maybe they used to, or like think they're understanding a painting because it like scrolls by so fast. I mean, so I think that, I don't know, I still feel like, maybe there's like a different threat of just like too many paintings, too many images of painting versus like experiencing painting. I mean, I love painting because it's slow, and I think, sort of to, connect to that tech comment is it's like, it's just such a slow medium, and like it's slow to make, or mine are slow to make, yours are very slow to make. And they can really, I'm interested in painting like holding time, right? So that like when you're looking at it, it takes, if you're open to it, if you spend more time with it, you'll see more and more, and there'll be things that you don't notice. And there's like passages, there's all these different passages. So like, if you want to put the time in, like it will give back to you sort of slowly. And so that idea that we can still like slow down and like not multitask, not be like reading, looking at our phone and talking on the phone, and I don't know, like looking at painting at the same time. I guess people do that, but that's what I like about it, is it grounds me and slows me down making them. And I think that's where, I think right now it's actually like it's, it hasn't been a useful medium for, over 100 years, right? It doesn't really have a function. So like in terms of like being, once photography hit, what's painting good for? And so I think right now to be actually like, that feels pretty profound. It's like, well, it's not, this ability just to like make us present, which I think is so hard for me too, like, just like slow down and be present.
So does it bug you for people to consume your imagery on a computer screen, or is this just sort of part of the package of being alive?
Yeah, it's part of, I mean, I feel like I'm sort of, I'm temperamentally not very great, like not a great fit for social media, so I don't really enjoy it, but I mean, I see the value of it. It's like we can see so much more, and that's great. You know, obviously I'd rather someone see them in person, right? And it's always the best feeling when people see your work in person and are surprised, I mean, hopefully in a good way, right?
Right. Hopefully in a good way.
Because like we think we know what something looks like when we just like scroll past an image.
Right.
And
I constantly have to remind my students it's not just about the surface, but the scale is always so surprising.
Yeah.
And now I feel like galleries are doing more and more, and other institutions of these, like, they're kind of slick, but it makes a certain amount of sense. These images of the painting with like a blurry person walking by, and you know, it begins to give you a sense, but still, like, being a body in front of the thing is an entirely different experience. So again, why we're so happy that this show is here. So, okay, I have one last question, and then maybe you all have some questions to ask, but I just thought, since we're here in San Francisco and you and I made the decision to come back here, and here we are and here we stay, that being back here, I feel like, you know, it's not the easiest place to be an artist, which is maybe an understatement, but between cost of living and people being stretched thin, and also just the artist community, I've found, you know, it's a harder to connect to. I'm not sure that it even is a solid thing as much as a place like New York City, where we've both experienced, or even LA. It's geographically more kind of fractured, and then we also have, you know, there's a sense of loss because of the loss of major institutions. But, you know, we're here and there's a lot going on still, and I'm just curious if we could end on a positive note and say, like, what do you love about being an artist in San Francisco Bay Area right now?
Well, I love that I teach at CCA. Thank you for all the CCA people who are here. And I think, like, for me, my experience of being an artist in the Bay Area is super intergenerational, because I'm like working with undergrads and grad students and fellow faculty, and then alumni. Like, I feel like there's such a great network of like folks from our institution, and it's like such a rich place in terms of like the artists who, you know, teach there. And so I think, you know, like, I think that for me, just like on a day-to-day level, I feel like super lucky, because I think that like provides like a lot of community and inspiration, you know, even if it takes me away from my studio on some level, but it's just like a really rewarding experience. So I think we've got that going. And I also think, like, I don't know, I mean, I was trained, like Craig mentioned, on the East Coast, but I feel very connected to like a West Coast, Northern Californian painting lineage. Like, I grew up sort of being obsessed with like Stephen Korn and David Park and the Bay Area, Joan Brown, Bay Area figurative painting. Still, like, some of my favorite painters are like Jay DeFeo and Jess, and like, I don't know, like, you know, there's just like a Roy DeForest, like there's sort of like a funky, fringy painting history here that's pretty awesome, and like continued through the mission school. And I think like one thing Northern California has going for it in a way is that it just isn't the center. And I think because of that, artists had less of commercial sort of bent to how they think about making art. I don't know, like I think there's sort of still the space for like experimentation and like, even if like commercially there's not as much of a structure as some other places, there's still a lot going on, and I don't know. Yeah, there's like a freedom, I think, to being an artist here in a way that I appreciate.
I like that. I feel like that's a good place to end, maybe with my questions, but maybe there are questions from you all.
Celeste.
Hello.
Hi.
I came in late, so if you already covered this, please say so. Heavy weather, thinking about all the fire risk around us and how that is. Did you already speak on this?
A little bit,
Okay.
but go ahead.
I mean, fall sunrise, for
Yes.
example.
Mm-hmm.
I focused on because it's triggering for me.
Yeah.
I was in the firestorm. I don't know if you were. Yeah.
I wasn't, but I had a lot of good friends. Yes.
Can you speak on, just go a little bit more in depth and maybe using that piece as an example?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I will say there is quite a bit of climate anxiety in this work, even though I think a lot of people read them as like very joyful, which I think is fair. Like I have a lot of fun painting, and I think maybe they look that way. But yeah, I think fall 2020, I started drawing fire, and like it's definitely in these, like thinking about fire, thinking about, you know, maybe perhaps the piece behind you, like that red sky day we had, right? Where like the whole sky was
The whole
bright
sky turned
orange.
cadmium red light.
Yes. Yes, exactly, right? So I think like that idea of like heightened senses, which I mean, yes, so that's definitely there. And I think speaking of like the firestorm, that sort of idea of like fire weather, I don't know if there's a few folks I know in here who were in the Bay Area at that point, and like it was such a crazy blustery day, if I'm remembering correctly. So the idea of like wind being like scary or like connected to, you know, yeah, like so I think that's definitely there for sure. And then another thing is that I realized I was making like these flood paintings, and I wasn't really kind of aware I was doing it. So like this painting here, I was painting it in like January 2023 when we had that insane rain year. I mean, it's been raining a lot, but like when it was like atmospheric river, and I was painting it and I was like, oh wait, like that's what's going on. So, you know, anyway, it happens that way sometimes. But yeah, there's definitely like, yeah, and I think that actually like that's where like I think the parenthood thing is like folded in deep with this work, even if like it's a little more subtle than some of my previous body of work. Is like I think that idea of like climate anxiety and like being a parent, and I think I sort of see a lot of it, yeah, through just having a small kid and wondering about that, you know. So yeah, you're welcome. Greg.
The most recent work sort of reads for me also a little bit sculptural, and I'm wondering whether you have a desire at one point to create some three-dimensional pieces.
You know, I do. I feel like I need more time. I like need a year-long sabbatical because, yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, you know, the tactility of my work has been there for a while, but I feel like it's very present in this work, and I don't know, maybe something linear, like three-dimensional and linear. It's very half-baked, but it's interesting you mentioned that.
Well, there's a floor upstairs, so I thought next time there could be a floor upstairs.
Sounds good.
You spoke a bit about starting these paintings with acrylic and then moving on to oil. And so you're still following the conventions of painting, of fat over lean. But are there unspoken rules that you set yourself when painting, or is it really about layering until the composition breaks apart, or right before that happens?
So yes, they are started with acrylic, and then I build from oil. Build up with oil. I started doing that because I just wanted to detox my studio, honestly, because I was using solvent, and it was like, I don't need to be doing this. So, so yeah, that's sort of how. So I do start them with acrylic. So when you say rules, do you mean like painting technical rules or other kinds of rules?
Other kinds.
Yeah.
Logics that you have on painting.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm very interested in, like, to go back to the sculptural comment, like play. I mean, there's so many painters who explore this, but I'm obsessed with it, of like what's on the surface, what is illusionistic, what sinks back, what comes forward. Like, I'm interested in playing around when you look at a part of it and you're like, you think it's the front, then you realize it's behind, or something flat cuts through something that's really thick. So I love that kind of like logic game, and I am interested in the paintings having like sort of a compositional rigor where they like holding together, but then they also feel like they might fall apart, kind of. Like there's like a tension where it seems very structured, but then also like a little bit like it's teetering. And so I like doing that. I had a friend come to my studio, and this is really obvious, but somehow I hadn't been really thinking about it in a very clear way, or I hadn't like articulated it. Just point out that a lot of the paintings have like something that comes like really close to the edge, specifically on the right side. And I was like, oh, I'm totally doing that. And I keep on doing it. But it's because of like, I like the sort of tension of like pushing against the edge. Like sort of this uncomfortableness that can happen with the structure. So that's something I'm thinking about. Yes.
I am very surprised that I've seen some the great instincts you have for shape and color is fantastic.
Thank you.
Maybe the best I've ever seen.
Thank you.
I would have bought a big one, but I don't have any room in my house.
Good excuse.
I don't think I've seen anybody better than you. The way you shape and color it, you have to have great instincts to do what you do.
Well, my first teaching job was teaching color theory, so kind of a nerd on that topic.
Did you have like a hardcore Albers experience at Yale, or were not doing that so much anymore?
It's funny you mentioned that. It's actually something I deeply regret. Is there was this professor, Dick Lytle, who was still teaching a version of the Albers class that I think was pretty close, which I could have audited, and I did not. And then when I got out of school, I got hired at Pratt to teach this class called Light, Color, and Design in the freshman program, which is pretty old school Albers, like a big part of the curriculum. So instead what I did is I met with my friend and we did all the projects so that we were like, I was like 2 weeks ahead of the students, which is like the secret that teachers don't want to say. You just have to stay 2 weeks ahead and you're okay.
That's right.
So yeah, I just had to like learn it.
Okay.
I knew some,
So
I knew
there.
some things, but yeah, unfortunately I did not take advantage of that.
Well, if that's it, I think, thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.